Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. As 2025 winds down, we've been doing a number of shows about how it's been quite a dramatic year, whether it's politics or technology or even sports. Things have changed dramatically. But in some areas, things don't seem to have changed at all. My guest today, one of America's leading thinkers on Russian foreign policy and U.S. involvement in Eastern and Central Europe, wrote a piece back in September 2024. It was entitled, "How Will the Russian War in Ukraine End?" And one wonders whether anything's changed in the last 18 months or 16 months since he wrote the piece. Jim Goldgeier is an old friend of mine. We went to grad school together, and he is one of the most responsible observers of American foreign policy. He's also the author of a wonderfully prescient book called America Between the Wars, from 11/9 to 9/11, which I think is one of the best books on American foreign policy since the collapse of the wall. Jim, is that fair to say that you wrote this piece for the Arms Control Association back in September 2024 about how the Russian war in Ukraine will end? Has anything changed in the last 16 months?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. And the big thing that changed is we went from a Biden administration to a Trump administration. So, and that's the biggest challenge right now for ending the war, because Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, just is not interested in ending the war on terms anything other than Russian control over Ukraine. That's what he's wanted from the start. He wants a Ukraine that is not free and independent. And unfortunately, Donald Trump has an envoy, Steve Witkoff, who seems to be channeling all of Putin's goals. And Donald Trump himself is, admires Putin so much that it's not possible to get into a situation where we're increasing the costs on Putin for continuing the war, and so he doesn't have any incentive to stop it.
Jim, let me give you a counterfactual. Let's just say that Harris had won the election. How could things have been different? I mean, couldn't one argue that Putin's self-interested? He's a Russian nationalist. He wants to, if not dismember Ukraine, certainly make it basically powerless on Russia's western border. So how could politics have made things different?
Well, I mean, yes, we could easily be in this same situation in that the war wouldn't be over. I mean, again, Putin's not interested in the war being over. I think what would be different is Ukraine would be in a potentially stronger situation because it would have more support from a Harris administration than it does from the Trump administration. It doesn't really have much support at all from the Trump administration. That doesn't mean the war would be over. I think that, again, as long as Putin's goal is to control Ukraine, and as long as he feels like the costs to him continuing the war aren't very high, or aren't high enough to make him do something different, then I think we're going to see this war continue. So I think the level of support from the Harris administration for Ukraine and for Ukraine's continued independence would be stronger than the Trump administration support. But yes, if Harris had won, we'd probably still be talking right now about the fact that this war isn't over and isn't likely to end anytime soon.
So in other words, it's in Putin's interest to continue the war. There's not a great deal the U.S. could do, whether it's the Trump administration or a Harris administration. And nothing will change until what? What has to happen? Does Trump have to march into Kiev? Does he have to get carte blanche with this deal that's supposedly now on the table?
Well, I mean, you have to give Putin an incentive to want to settle this war. The Ukrainians, I think, are prepared to have a settlement to the war. Certainly one that, I mean, they realize that Russia isn't going to be giving up the territory that it currently controls. Ukraine doesn't want to be asked, as it has been asked by the Trump administration, to give up territory that Ukraine controls. There's no reason why Ukraine should be giving up territory that it controls. I mean, Putin couldn't win it militarily. We shouldn't be giving it to him. And politically, it would just be too difficult for that. But at some point, the question is, can you make the cost of this war high enough for Putin that he decides that he wants to settle it on some kind of terms? And we're not putting much pressure on him at all. I mean, this is an administration that doesn't believe in making Putin squirm. Either in terms of additional sanctions, although he's been able to deal with those. The Chinese have helped with that a lot. Or by providing Ukraine with more military assistance that would enable them to increase the cost to the Russians of continuing the war. I don't know any other way to create some kind of solution to this that doesn't involve forcing Ukraine to just give up, which they're not going to do. The only way I see it is if you just increase the costs on Putin to a higher level. But even then, it's still hard because he's able to withstand. He's shown he's able to withstand a lot of costs to his country. I mean, 1 million casualties, killed and wounded, is a lot of people that have been harmed or killed by this war in Russia.
We're speaking on December the 20th. This will go out in the next few days. Today, Zelensky said that only the US can persuade Russia to end the Ukraine war. Meanwhile, the Finnish president said that the Russia-Ukraine peace deal is closer than any other point during the war. Sometimes when I read these headlines, Jim, and I'm a non-insider like you, I'm trying to interpret what these guys mean. So what does Zelensky mean? Is he putting pressure on Trump? Because presumably Europe could persuade Russia to end the Ukraine war if they declared war on Russia, couldn't it? I mean, it's not just a US problem.
Well, it's not just the US problem, but the US is the most powerful country involved. And I think what Zelensky understands is that what Putin most wants is he most wants to be able to sit down with Donald Trump and agree on a solution to the war. He's not really interested in involving the Europeans. He's not even interested in involving the Ukrainians. I mean, there's been talk on and off over the years about Putin and Zelensky sitting down. Putin has no interest in sitting down with Zelensky. He views Zelensky as an illegitimate president of a country that shouldn't exist. So he's not going to sit down with the guy. He wants to, he wants one of these US-Russia old style summits, deciding everything. And I think what Zelensky's trying to do is make the case that Ukraine is ready to settle this war on terms that, should be okay with Putin, in that Putin's controlling, 20% of Ukrainian territory, and nobody's going to force him off that. So, but it's not enough for Putin. And so I think Zelensky's just trying to encourage the Trump team to think about ways in which they could get Putin to agree that enough's enough. But that's going to be a tough sell. Again, you got to raise the costs to Putin to get him to agree to this.
So let me just ask you this. You keep on saying raise the costs. Clearly, America won't go to war over Ukraine. Right. And I'm guessing even you wouldn't suggest they should.
No.
What does raising the costs mean? I mean, the embargo doesn't seem to have been particularly effective. Everyone's breached it one way or the other. What if you were in charge of American foreign policy and you have all sorts of connections in Washington, D.C., it's not inconceivable. What would you do? How do you raise costs?
Well, I don't have connections with this administration.
Yeah, I know you don't, but you have connections. And in fact, your co-author of your excellent America Between the Wars is Derek Chollet, who's a very influential Democratic foreign policy person over the years.
When I say raise the costs, I have two things in mind. So first of all, there are the economic costs, and this has been tough. We've sanctioned the heck out of Russia, and the sanctions. People say, "Oh, the sanctions haven't worked." The Russian economy is not doing that great. How badly would it have to do for it to affect Putin politically is a good question. I mean, and the biggest question of all is what would it take for Putin to believe that politically he can't keep doing this, or it hurts his position. I mean, he controls the political situation in Russia, so it's very difficult. But I think whatever additional economic pressure can be put on would help to raise the costs. And then it's supplying Ukraine with the weapons that they need to inflict greater damage on the Russian military and on Russia itself. And that's been an issue from the start. There's been, the West has been supporting Ukraine since the full-scale invasion of February 2022, but it's wanted to keep that support within some bounds out of fear of escalating, because the West doesn't want a war with Russia. It's also important to recognize Russia doesn't want a war with NATO. So I think there's more room there for maneuver than a lot of people think. But I think other than trying to make it harder for the Russian economy to be successful and trying to make it more painful for the Russian military to continue this war are the only two ways I know of to increase the cost. But even that, again, might not be enough. Putin may be strong enough politically within Russia that he can withstand any of this. But we don't know. And the more pressure, the better.
So on the one hand, nothing seems to have changed, and yet on the other, everything seems to have changed. Earlier this year, I had your friend, your colleague at Stanford, Mike McFaul, on the show. His new book, Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder, talks about a new world of three great powers, increasingly autocratic. So when we look back at 2025, Jim, is McFaul, and it's not just McFaul, but McFaul's observation about a return to the great power politics of the 19th century, is that increasingly self-evident, for better or worse?
Well, I think probably what the most interesting feature of 2025 is from the standpoint of great power competition, is the change in the United States, and certainly the Trump administration's efforts to move the United States away from its democracy is notable. But from a foreign policy standpoint, it's worth seeing the difference between 2025 and the national security strategy that was just released by the Trump administration and the way the Trump administration talked during its first term between 2017 and 2021, because that national security strategy in the first Trump administration was the one that really sort of made it clear that the United States is in this new world of strategic competition with these other major powers, and that the whole foreign policy that was predicated after September 11, 2001 on terrorist organizations, counterterrorism, that involved the wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq, that we were moving to this new era, and we needed to be thinking about how to had to engage in competition with China and with Russia. The new national security strategy, Trump 2.0, Trump 2025, is basically saying, look, our main goal is to dominate the Western Hemisphere. And we're not as interested in other parts of the world. And it's you mentioned the 19th century. I think that's an apt comparison, because what you see from the Trump administration is sort of old style. Great powers should have spheres of influence, and they should recognize each other's spheres of influence. And this would be a marked departure for the United States in the post-Cold War era, with the United States basically saying, look, Russia should have its sphere in Eastern Europe, and China can have its sphere in its neighborhood, and we're going to dominate our sphere in the Western Hemisphere, and sort of more of an accommodation among the great powers than the kind of strategic competition that the Trump administration in the first term was talking about. So that may be the big change in Trump 2.0.
But shouldn't we welcome that? I mean, American foreign policy since the Second World War has basically accepted that Russia should dominate Eastern Europe. Is that one way of guaranteeing? I'm not suggesting that the US or the West in general should suggest that Russia invades Poland or the Baltic states. But is that a condition of peace, Jim? For Russia to at least feel secure on its Western border, this obsession with the West, Napoleon, Hitler, blah, blah, blah?
Well, I think the United States, I mean, the Russian narrative is that the United States, after the end of the Cold War, was out to humiliate Russia, and it was out to, to harm Russia and bring it down, bring it to its knees, and so on. That's sort of the Putin line. I don't think the evidence really bears this out. The United States, after the end of the Cold War, reduced its military presence greatly in Europe. I mean, it was not seeking to enhance a military presence that would threaten Russia, but in fact to reduce a military presence to try to help the Russians feel more reassured that the United States doesn't have designs on Russia and to undermine Russian security. And the big question is, do you want a world in which countries in Eastern Europe can be sovereign and independent? That would be the world I would wish for. That's what we've been pushing for since the end of the Cold War. Or do you want a world in which the Russians get to dominate and decide what goes on in those countries? And which is not my preferred world. And there is this difference in the way that security prior to 2025, there is this difference in the way security in that region has been defined by the West and by Russia. The West has argued that these countries are sovereign and independent. Russia should respect that, and that the West is not interested in harming Russia or, attacking Russia or bringing Russia down, but that it would like Russia to be a neighbor that respects the sovereignty and independence of these countries. And Russia is not interested in the sovereignty and independence of these countries. It wants to control them, and most notably in Ukraine. And those are two very different visions. And I don't think we should be in the business of saying, well, the Russian vision is the one we should go with. I don't think that's something we should be agreeing with. And I certainly think it's incredibly dangerous for the people in the region who don't live in Russia and don't want to live under Russian control.
Isn't there, Jim, though, a kind of mutual paranoia here? I take your point on the Russians being irrational in their fear of the US, given post 9/11 US policy in the area and NATO. Sure. But in the West, there's all this talk, especially in Eastern Europe, of if we allow the West, allow Russia to win in Ukraine, and I don't know what winning in Ukraine really means, then the Baltics will be next, and then Poland, and then Germany, and then Paris. Is that unwise as well to reinvent Putin as Stalin or Hitler when he's struggling to even defeat Ukraine in this catastrophic war economically and in terms of the bloodshed, but from a military point of view, it hasn't exactly reflected well on the Russians.
Yeah, no, I don't think we have to worry about Russia, the Russian military marching across Europe. This isn't a post-1945 situation. What winning does look like to Putin, we know what winning looks like to Putin with respect to Ukraine, and that is controlling Ukraine. It's having a government in Ukraine that is loyal to him, and a Ukrainian government that does what he wants and is not seeking to be part of the Western orbit. I mean, he's just doesn't believe Ukraine should be an independent country.
But he doesn't want to, jumping in here, Jim, he doesn't want a Stalinist client state, does he? I mean, presumably, would he accept the existence of quote unquote free and fair elections so that Ukrainians can still vote for political leaders they want?
I don't believe he does want. I don't believe he doesn't want that. I think he wants a government that he can put in place. That's what he was trying to do in February of 2022. He was trying to. The goal was to invade the country so that, and he had a plan of a number of Ukrainians that he thought he could put in power, who would govern the country. I think it's wildly unrealistic, though, because then he faces a country where, okay, maybe he controls the government, but the population is trying to counter that at every turn. He has a counterinsurgency movement. I don't think any of this is very realistic.
Yeah, we'd be back to the Eastern Europe, we'd be back to Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Poland. You've written, sorry, go on.
No. With respect to the rest, I mean, certainly if we allowed him to succeed in Ukraine, the Balts and the Poles would be nervous because they would be nervous about whether he had further designs, and they would be nervous about whether we were there to support them. It doesn't mean he necessarily has designs on these countries. Occasionally he talks about it because he talks about his vision. I mean, he wants to sort of rebuild the Russian Empire. He sees himself in the Tsarist tradition, and he thinks these lands belong to him, and lands that he feels like are historically Russian. He wants to restore as either formally part of Russia or controlled by Russia. And I don't think we should be in the business of helping him succeed in that.
You've written extensively on NATO. You wrote a piece back in 2023 about NATO's enlargement didn't cause Russia's aggression. I know you've got an imminent piece coming out in early January on NATO as well. Does NATO have a place in this new world order, or what your friend Mike McFaul calls new world disorder?
Well, the value of NATO is that, I mean, from a United States standpoint, is it binds together, it's got 32 members. So from a U.S. standpoint, it binds together 31 other countries, democracies for the most part. There's a couple exceptions, but binds together these countries in that are there to help essentially further the interests of that group of countries. And it doesn't mean they're out to get Russia. It doesn't mean they're out to get China, but it does mean that they are trying to be together to push back against Russia and China when those two countries are doing things that undermine Western interests. And, Putin engages in a lot of sabotage in Europe. I mean, he's engages in election interference, and his goal is to undermine the West. I don't think we should be in the business of assisting him in those efforts.
When you say his goal is to undermine the West, you've acknowledged he doesn't want to invade Paris or London. So what does he want to do? Just be a fly in the ointment?
Well, yeah, I think for him, and I think this is the reason why he has this this relationship that he does with Xi Jinping in China, is that the two of them view, especially the United States, as a country that is too big, too powerful, has sought to dominate the world, has, Putin's speeches from, some years ago about the United States wanting to tell everybody else what to do, wants to run the world. Same kind of language that was in Trump's 2025 the recent national security strategy, basically national security strategy saying, U.S. used to try to do this, used to try to run the world. We're not going to do that anymore. And there's an important discussion to be had about that. But I think for Putin, for Xi, they view the United States as too powerful. They would like to see it brought down a notch or two. And I think he's out to try to do what he can to undermine U.S. influence, U.S. financial power. Certainly, the United States still maintains that. Be in a position where the United States can't act around the globe the way it did previously. And again, maybe it shouldn't. I mean, we that's a debate we should be having.
Yeah, and you covered that very well in your America Between the Wars, the unipolar moment in in global history, really. Jim, has 2025 been the year where I don't know if they're pro-Putin, but certainly less hostile to Putin forces in Europe, from Orban in Hungary to Le Pen in France to Nigel Farage in the UK. Is there in your sense at least, a growing sentiment in Europe that the Russians are no better or worse than the United States?
Well, I think there is a growing force within Europe that is favorable to Putin and favorable to Russian interests, and that those leaders, whether they're a leader of a country like Orban or whether they're leaders of parties such as Le Pen in France or the AfD in Germany. You mentioned Farage. I mean, these are groups and individuals that the Trump administration is trying to support, and I think that's unfortunate. Look, you can argue for a different type of approach within Europe, and I think hope for a better relationship with Russia. I mean, I think over the long run, we should hope for a better relationship with Russia, but let's not misunderstand what Vladimir Putin is all about. I mean, this is an evil man who's done extraordinary damage. This war is horrendous, and he's not really interested in. He's not interested in engaging with a group of democracies to create a more peaceful and just order in Europe. He's not going to be around forever. I mean, he could still be around for quite a while, unfortunately. But there will come a time down the road when hopefully there are different possibilities for a relationship with Russia, but it should be a relationship that's built on respect for the sovereignty and independence of countries. And if countries in Europe vote for leaders that take them in a direction like the direction the United States has gone in under Donald Trump, then that's up to those populations, just as the American people voted in 2024, and this is what we have in 2025. Doesn't seem to be too popular right now, but this is what we have in 2025. But we shouldn't be wanting a hostile relationship with Russia forever. I just think it's going to be hard to have a different relationship as long as Putin's in power.
Are there any glimmers of hope in Europe in terms of negotiating, innovating in this new world disorder? Giorgia Meloni in Italy sometimes comes up in terms of hopeful signs of politicians who the West once imagined to be more sympathetic to Putin, having come to power a little more balanced.
Yeah, she's a very interesting figure because when she came to power, I was concerned that she would be pro-Putin, and she has been very much, she's been very supportive of Ukraine during this war, and very much against what Putin has been doing. The challenge for Europe, and it certainly is a challenge. I mean, Donald Trump's not the first person to identify it, but he has certainly pushed Europe more than any other president. I mean, Europe does need to take on more of the burden for itself. It is a rich group of countries, and the United States does not need to be playing the role that it has played since the end of the Second World War. Europe can take over more of the responsibility for how Europe's affairs are managed and how it takes care of its own defense. And I think, any president going forward should be pushing for that. But so far, Europe hasn't really shown that it's capable of doing that. And so that remains a huge uncertainty as we go into 2026.
Should we at least credit the Trump administration with bringing this open secret out and actually talking about it, this problem? I mean, Trump recently talked about something he called civilizational erasure. Some people might argue that's already happened in the US through him. J.D. Vance made an incredibly controversial speech at the Munich conference back in the summer. Is it good that this stuff's out? And when historians look back at 2025, are these going to be seen as key moments? Trump's civilizational erasure moment and J.D. Vance's appearance and incredibly controversial speech at Munich?
So I think they're two separate things. So one, which I would hope the United States at some point in the future disavows, is this attack on immigrants. I mean, it's what's happening here in the US, and the Trump administration is taking that to Europe. In a national security strategy where they say we're not going to get involved and interfere in other people's business, they single out the Europeans because they don't like the immigration in Europe. And, immigration's been a tough issue in Europe, but that really is for Europeans to decide. And the idea that if you have immigrants in Europe and it's no longer as white as it was, that somehow is destroying Europe, I think, I hope that there'll be an administration down the road that disavows that kind of attitude towards immigrants here and in Europe. The other issue is the European contribution to its own defense. And while I don't like the Trump tactics of trying to bully Europe on this, it is the case that in the hopes of trying to appease Donald Trump, the Europeans have committed to greater defense spending than they otherwise would have. So I do think that that's an important feature of what we've seen this year. They did commit in the summer at the NATO summit to increase defense spending significantly. And I think the Europeans are understanding that the United States is not as reliable an ally as it was before. And so they are going to have to do something to take care of themselves. But again, that's something that is a long way off because they just haven't shown that they can pull together in that way on their defense. But I think these are two separate issues. The sort of whether Europe can tolerate the kind of immigration that it's had, and I think certainly I feel like in the United States, immigrants have made this country stronger, and the Trump administration may decide that it wants to attack diversity. I think diversity makes us stronger. So, those are issues for Europe to decide by itself. But we shouldn't be lecturing Europe on those issues. Those are issues that they will need to decide politically for themselves.
Yeah, and you've spent your career very much committed to internationalism, one kind or another. You've just been elected president of the International Studies Association, a coalition of global scholars. So you mean what you say. Jim, what should the Democrats be doing as we look forward to 2026? I'm not sure if you heard a recent interesting interview. Ezra Klein interviewed Gavin Newsom. Newsom's been on this show a few times. And they talked extensively about all sorts of things: new building, energy, innovation, blah, blah, blah. They didn't mention foreign policy. Now, if Newsom is the Democratic front runner for 2028, and as these Democrats begin to flex their muscles next year, should they be imagining a new kind of foreign policy? It seems as if what's really revolutionary about the Trump foreign policy is its performative quality. There was a series of articles this week about Jared Kushner pitching a $112 billion tech utopia out of the Gaza rubble. Now, everybody knows that's not for real, but it's performative, in perhaps in the same way as Steve Witkoff, you mentioned him earlier, calling Ukrainian talks in Miami productive. They're not telling the truth, but they're performing both for Trump and perhaps for social media. Do the Democrats need to learn a new kind of performative foreign policy? And beyond that, what should they be saying that's different from Trump? You can't just go back to Biden, can you?
No, and I do think so. So I'll give you an example that I think was a mistake that Biden made in his first year in office, as something that we shouldn't be doing. So what Biden basically, with the message to the Europeans in the spring of 2021, the message to the Europeans was, America's back. And basically the way that was heard and read in Europe was, okay, phew, we don't really have to do all those things the Trump administration wanted us to do. And we can go back to letting the United States run everything. You know, the unipolar moment that you mentioned from the 90s, like we're not in that world. We don't have the resources. We shouldn't be having the aspirations to run the world like we used to. So the question is, what is our relationship to the rest of the world? We also shouldn't be doing the kind of military interventions that we've done previously. And, you know, Donald Trump has been focused on Venezuela in this way.
But doesn't that seem, it strikes me as that's also performative. It's rather like the pleasure he seems to get out of the cruelty of Doge, cruelty of the ice people is he's showing off about stuff that always happened, but most politicians kept quiet.
So yes, but I think the biggest challenge, and it's the one, again, we missed it we didn't get it in the Biden years, and we've got to figure it out for whatever comes after Trump, is we should want allies. I mean, you know, why should you be alone in the world? You know, I mean, it's good to have friends. And I think it's good for us to have Canada as an ally, to have our European allies, Japan, South Korea. It's good to have these allies because they can help us together try to promote our interests. But we will require a different relationship than we had with them from, you know, 1945 till 2017, or, you know, in the case of the 4 years of the Biden administration, during those 4 years, it's going to have to be different. And we don't, you know, we haven't defined that yet. The Democrats have been focused on Trump taking a sledgehammer to the kind of alliance relationships that we've had for such a long time. But we haven't articulated a new way of engaging with these countries on terms where we're doing less, they're doing more, but we're still collaborating and cooperating together. That to me, that's the challenge that's one of the challenges for the Democratic Party going forward.
But it's astonishing that no one's actually addressing it. I mean, at least Klein wrote his Abundance book. We can't go back to the world of Tony Blinken and Joe Biden. Are there people in DC really thinking radically, critically about what the Democrats would do on the world stage if they come back to power, which they probably will do certainly, if not in 2028, by the early 2030s?
Yeah, there are. I mean, there's conversations that are taking place privately. There's efforts to bring people together. I mean, the question is, you know, if you're bringing people together that served in the Biden administration, can they do the kind of creative new thinking? We don't know that yet. You know, but I think there is a general recognition that we're not going back to the world that we dominated previously. and that the American people don't want us doing as much as we were doing before. And so, I mean, there is an effort to start having these conversations, but I think we're well away from having any kind of articulate sense of what that is. But it's got to be it's got to be constructive. It can't be the destruction of the Trump years. I mean, it's basically everything was wrong, so we're just going to destroy it all. All right, well, now what are you going to do? What are you going to do, for example, if you're a Democrat and you win in 2028 and you come into office in 2029 and you want to have a functioning federal government that has expertise, scientific expertise, foreign policy expertise, all sorts of expertise that was gotten rid of by this administration. How are you going to rebuild that? It's daunting. I mean, it's going to be tough, but you're going to want to rebuild American science. You're going to want to rebuild faith in vaccines. You're going to want to rebuild an effort to relate.
I take your point, but can you go back to the old professionalized State Department? You gave an interesting interview to NPR earlier this year about Trump firing historians who put together unbiased accounts of U.S. foreign policy. I take your point. I'm certainly not disagreeing with you, but don't we even need to think differently, or certainly progressives need to think differently about what a professional foreign policy person is, perhaps introduce new technology, even AI on this front?
So I think the most interesting questions will be, how do we think about having expertise in the government that's not necessarily people making their careers in the government, right? Because you can develop foreign policy expertise outside the government. You can develop scientific expertise outside the government. Like, how do you, we've done this, at sort of the political level, but do you, I mean, I think we gain a lot from having foreign service officers who, do develop expertise and are able to operate in countries, but it's not the only way of developing expertise. And you could have people who are engaged outside the government, who come into the government for shorter periods of time, and then they go back out and, maybe they get experience in the private sector. They get experience working out in the field for non-governmental organizations, whatever it is. I don't think we're just going to go back to, I don't think we can go back to just sort of rebuilding the old establishment. I mean, USAID is gone, right? So if you come in 2029 and you think we should be doing more development because you've seen how many people have died with the cutbacks to aid that has taken place in this administration, how should we be doing development? I mean, again, I don't have the answers to it. And I don't think it's going to be, well, we'll just rebuild what we had before, because that's not going to happen. So, yeah, we're going to have to rethink this stuff. But, we do have some time to do that thinking.
I'm not sure how much time. Let's end. You don't have a lot of time, at least in terms of this interview, Jim. What should we be? I'm not asking you to predict what's going to happen in 2026, because that's an unfair question, especially with something like Ukraine. Ross Douthat wrote an interesting op-ed today talking about a Marco Rubio moment. He seems to think that Marco Rubio now holds all the cards when it comes to the Trump administration, especially on the foreign policy front. Sounds a little surprising, counterintuitive to me. But what should we be looking for in 2026 when it comes to the reinvention, if you like, of American foreign policy in this, if not revolutionary age, certainly age of great disruption in international politics?
Well, first of all, I do think Rubio is a fascinating character, because you wouldn't have expected him,
of all people. I mean, he's
close to Trump, the way Trump talked about him when they ran against each other for president. Rubio's time in the Senate was very different in terms of his approach, for example, to aid. He argued that USAID played an important role. He argued U.S. soft power was important. He argued that a lot of these things were important. But you've got two things going on. clearly, I mean, one, Rubio positioning himself to be an important part in the MAGA world and doing so successfully. I mean, he is both the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, in addition to being the acting archivist of the United States. So he's clearly been successful in positioning himself. And Trump has been extremely complimentary and respectful toward him in a way that, you know, when he was doing his whole Lil Marco stuff, he wasn't. So I think he is certainly an individual to watch.
And should we be contrasting him with J.D. Vance? Is it one or the other? Are they really battling now to control a post-Trump Republican Party?
Well, I think they both would like to succeed Donald Trump. So I think we will see that. And they have differed on the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, J.D. Vance has made very clear he's not interested in Ukraine, doesn't care about Ukraine, doesn't think it's part of America's interest. I mean, Rubio, I think, understands that it's in America's interest that Ukraine not be defeated in this war, but he's also been sort of carving out a position where he's trying to put more on the Europeans and basically arguing, look, this war is in Europe. It's not in our neighborhood, it's in Europe's. It's in Europe. So, but I just, on the war itself, I think what we will be looking for is there a plan put forward by the United States that doesn't ask Ukraine to give up territory to Russia that Ukraine is currently controlling? And is there a significant notion of how Ukraine will defend itself, be defended? You know, we talk about security guarantees, but it's really what can be done to help Ukraine be in a position where Russia can't attack it again. I mean, until we deal with that issue, it's not going to be really possible to end this war. And I think we should expect the war to continue on for some time. I don't see anything that's going to change that.
Well, that's a depressing note, Jim, to end our conversation, but maybe you're right. Maybe it's good to be honest. Misquote.
I would love to be wrong. I would love to be wrong.
Yeah, to remix Charles Dickens, it seems to be a time where everything's changing and nothing's changing simultaneously. But we shall see. 2026 might offer some promise with Ukraine and certainly for America to reinvent itself and its attitude to the world. Jim Goldgeier, thank you so much. We will look forward to talking to you in the new year because there will, for better or worse, certainly be developments on the U.S. foreign policy front. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.